world just rolling along, just rolling along. I'm sitting on top of the world, just rolling along.
Welcome to the very first episode of the Solo Dungeon Crawler podcast. I've been umming and ahhing about doing this for quite some time now, and in the end I just decided to sit down and just wing it. The reason I decided to do a podcast, an audio-only podcast, is mainly because I seem to move forward with my hobby faster than I can document it for anybody who is interested in following me and my solo role-playing activities. So I guess this podcast is aiming to achieve several things. Firstly, and probably foremost, is that I want to maximise the amount of potential fun that I can have with my solo role-playing experiences. And secondly, this gives me an opportunity to share more content with you, because a podcast is essentially easier for me to record and put together and get something out to anyone who wants to listen quicker. And thirdly, there's a variety of things I want to try in terms of solo role-playing, and I think that if I can essentially find a way to share things with you that doesn't have as many loopholes that I have to jump through, i.e. editing massive amounts of video and pulling in resources such as artwork and other types of imagery, basically lowering the production investment that I need to make, essentially allows me more flexibility to just kind of be very creative with how I approach my solo gaming life. So what would you expect from this podcast? Well, I'm working out the details myself, to be honest, but I'll be looking to impart hobby updates, things that I've been doing in regards to the hobby itself. And the scope for this might not just cover solo play, it might cover the wider universe of TTRPGs, as well as, I guess, nerd culture in general. And I'll share some interesting insights as and when I come across them, how I handled certain games that I've been playing. I'm going to provide updates in the form of almost like battle reports for some of my games. But I think most importantly, the focus of this podcast will be to give other solo players something to listen to that will hopefully help them improve their own games or feel inspired with their own games, or motivated to try new things. I'm not claiming to be some sort of solo role-playing guru, absolutely not. But I just think that because I get a lot of enjoyment out of it, I just want to share what I've been doing with other people in hopes that they might be encouraged, and anything that I come across or come up with that might be of value to other people doing something similar to me, then I think that this is a great platform to share that, to help further the hobby. Solo role-playing TTRPGs is not anything new. This harkens back to the very beginning. People have been doing this since at least the mid-70s, but I suspect that people have been solo wargaming for at least a decade or so before that. So I'm not 100% certain how I'm going to incorporate everything that I do into this podcast. You might find yourself listening to this because you've been watching my Castle of the Quest series, or you've watched my solo D&D tutorial videos, or been listening to the Tales of Mystara podcast, and so on. So I think what I'm going to do is bring all of that into this podcast, which will act as, I guess, the sort of home base from where everything else kind of branches out. But what I think I might aim to do is periodically pull out the different fragments from the various campaigns that I'm running and documenting on YouTube as video, and edit them together into video, and then update those individual playlists for each of my individual campaigns. So anybody who wants to keep following those campaigns can do so at their leisure, and hopefully the method of obtaining these updates won't change, or at least won't be too heavily disrupted. But also there will be this podcast which will have updates on everything, plus a lot more as well. So essentially it's up to you as the viewer or listener how you want to digest that content. And at the moment this is just me kind of brainstorming ideas. I don't actually know 100% what the future will have in store. I think since the birth of this channel I've flitted about from thing to thing. Various projects have gone on hiatus and then returned. I don't presume to be the most methodical person when it comes to this channel, or even the most consistent with my uploading of videos. But hopefully this podcast might address that at least a little bit, and it might mean that I get more content out on a more regular basis. But let's see what happens. Welcome to the Castle of the Quest, which, if you don't know, is my OD&D solo campaign, and this is a campaign that I'm playing using one-to-one time, and it's been quite an exciting venture so far because I keep uncovering revelation after revelation of OD&D stuff that I didn't realise or wasn't aware of, and it's really changed my understanding of the rules, and it's definitely had an impact on how I approach solo gaming in general. So far in this campaign, I think I've maybe made one or two oracle rolls, but using an old system like original D&D, and it would be the same with AD&D and many of the pre-D20 versions of D&D. It's not skill-based. Much of modern D&D is rolling a D20, adding a bonus, checking that against a target number to see if the character was successful or not. OD&D is a lot more modular, and it's very specific in its procedures, which means you can have a really detailed solo campaign going, and there will be mostly no need for an oracle. I'm quite fond of it. I think it's a perfect solo role-playing system for anyone who wants to be a solo gamer. So I definitely recommend original D&D. But that put to one side, what's actually been happening in my game? My party of adventurers, who call themselves the Questing Knights, have had some fairly recent success with treasure, so have ended up having quite a large encumbrance of gold, or more specifically platinum, because they went to a moneylender to have the coins transferred into a rarer precious metal, so they were carrying less weight. And more recently, they decided to venture out into the wilderness and find a nice spot to build a stronghold. But first they had to venture into various unknown hexes to try and find a settlement that was populated enough to have an engineer living in the settlement. So everything that has happened so far in this campaign can be viewed on YouTube in the Castle of the Quest playlist. But the party managed to locate an engineer, and they managed to hire the engineer to build, to begin with, a small structure which will act as kind of a temporary keep while they venture back out and seek more adventure to gain more treasure, so they can eventually build this stronghold into a large stone structure with various defences, battlements and so on. Now, strongholds are something that was talked about in the 3 original brown books of OD&D, and they are also discussed in more detail in the AD&D DMG. But the whole idea of constructing strongholds seems to have been largely lost in more modern editions of the game. But they offer some interesting opportunities in OD&D, particularly sieges can be carried out against the stronghold, and the man-to-man rules in Chainmail, which has various procedures to handle castle sieges, would then come into play. But I guess as we started getting into basic D&D with Dr. Eric Holmes's version, followed by Moldvay and Cook's and then Frank Mentzer's, the whole idea of defending strongholds just kinda fell to the side, which I think is a shame, and I'm looking forward to getting into the emergent play that will come from my party building a stronghold. And a lot of these details I'm going to have to try and work out myself, because it doesn't really give you much detail in OD&D as to how to operate these strongholds. But one of the main advantages is that once you have a stronghold, the player characters no longer have to pay upkeep every month, and at higher level, characters can start to control the countryside and receive various revenue coming in from local towns and villages and so on. So I think this sort of domain type plays, it sounds cool, and I'm looking forward to reaching a level of gaming where that all starts to come into play. But I'm still very, very, very much in the early stages. But the challenge with doing this in solo play is I need to make sure that the procedures are fully mapped out, detailed, expanded. So a major challenge for me with trying to shed some light on the rules for constructing castles and strongholds in OD&D is the fact that the illustration in the book, which has all the prices for each type of building, seems really incomplete, and it has various inconsistencies. I've managed to kind of analyse the illustration and extrapolate some costs that I'm satisfied with, that seem rational and logic, I've actually seen some OSR products try to reconstruct some of these prices, and it's clear that it's just been brushed over, and it doesn't seem like anyone's really made any effort to kind of sit down and understand why the prices don't make sense. And you have to remember that there's been several versions of OD&D, and in the earlier versions the illustration is actually different, but if you compare the two and compare the prices of the two, they're the same. So it makes no sense to me to redraw the illustration but not correct the prices if they're wrong. So I suspect that the prices aren't wrong. It just takes a little bit of analysis to figure out why they are the way that they are. And I'm not going to get into that here in detail, because it'll really bog down the episode. But what I am going to do is post an article on my blog at solodungeoncrawler.blogspot.com, and in that article I'll do my best to explain the logic that I was able to arrive at in terms of what the construction costs should be and why there are inconsistencies. And I think the article hopefully will clear those up for anybody who wants to use the costs given in the OD&D books to create strongholds in their own campaign. My adventuring party, the Questing Knights, have the equivalent of 7,255 gold pieces. So what size keep can they actually build? They'll be forced to build just a single story for now, as anything taller is too expensive. They're pretty much limited to a keep that is 30 feet wide and 10 feet high. It's going to be pretty cramped in there at first, but it will be enough for them to bunk down and hopefully find space to store some things. It will take 3 weeks for an engineer to construct this, so the cost will be 6,000 for the building and 3 weeks' wages for the engineer, totaling 6,562 gold pieces and 5 silver. They will of course be forced to pay for the construction with Ilara's black sapphire necklace, which is something that she bought from a jeweler in order to transfer excess weight in gold into something more manageable. And if she trades this necklace back to a jeweler, it's worth 20% less than its original buying price, basing this on what a jeweler would be willing to pay for it as per the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, which is always a good resource for clearing up some of the ambiguity in OD&D. So anything that's not explained in detail in OD&D can sometimes be clarified using the AD&D books, especially the DMG. And of course the OD&D books do not go into any level of detail regarding economics, but page 90 of the DMG says that transactions involving gems are not uncommon, but a surtax of 10% is also levied against sales or exchange of precious stones and similar goods. So really this black sapphire is worth 6,300 to the engineer, and in coin the party has 51 platinum pieces, which is a further 255 gold. They also have 2 gold pieces and 8 silver, totaling 6,557 gold plus the 8 silver. So they are currently 5 gold short. As the party have already negotiated with the engineer, it would not bode well to do it again, and they may lose the opportunity they have already secured. So as an alternative, they could build a wooden keep instead, as a temporary measure, till they can secure more treasure. They just simply can't afford to do any any better than that right now. Curiously, the early prints of Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, before the final 7th print, has some additional text in the construction section which has prices for building wooden buildings and palisades, and these will be helpful in pricing things up. I don't know why they weren't included in the later edition. It's a few paragraphs of text that just didn't carry over. There doesn't seem to be anything wrong with these prices. They just weren't carried over for some reason. The DMG says that wooden buildings take half the time as stone buildings. So a 120-foot wooden building will take 2 months, and a 240-foot circular palisade surrounding it will take 3 months, and all this will cost 2,250 gold. So in exchange for the black sapphire, the party get 10 platinum pieces in change, and will have their small wooden stronghold ready in 5 months' time. So the party will now return to the Last Redoubt, which is their hometown, and await construction of their new home in the meantime, perhaps finding a little adventure to pass the days. So a bit of extended coverage for my Castle of the Quest campaign. So on the 29th of March of 2024, the party decided it was time to venture out again, seeking fortune. They decided it was time for another town adventure in the village of Greenford, which is a town that exists over on the west coast of my campaign map, which is an island called Pylea. And as the party are out of pocket, they're coming down to their last 60 platinum pieces. They can't really afford to run a recruitment campaign to hire NPCs, so I decided that going into a dungeon was probably a little bit risky, especially now I have a few characters that have managed to reach level 2. I don't want to lose them. These characters are very precious to me now. I only have 2 that have managed to reach level 2, and that is my magic user, Ilara Nightshade, who is the leader of the questing knights, and brother Bart, a cleric, has also managed to reach level 2, but currently that's it. So before they set out, the party decided to purchase some equipment. So they bought 6 extra daggers, 2 slings, and 60 sling stones. And the reason they did this was solely to improve their missile combat abilities, because it's a huge advantage if you have a group of monsters coming at you, charging at you in OD&D. It's a huge advantage to be able to give pass through fire to the monsters as they charge. So having missile capability is really important, and if you're lucky enough, then you might be able to wipe out most of the group, even all of the group, before they manage to get to you. So it reduces the chances of suffering casualties. So I decided to kit them out a little bit better, and this only set the party back 22 gold pieces in total. So in their possession at the moment, they have 57 platinum pieces and 8 silver pieces, and this is the equivalent of 283 gold pieces. You might actually be wondering, why have you purchased a sling? This is OD&D. A sling is not in the basic equipment list. And that's a good question. And also, in terms of daggers, OD&D doesn't really say much in the rules about handheld weapons. So I've actually covered my thoughts on this in a blog article posted on my blog at solodungeoncrawler.blogspot.com. But for the benefit of the listener, I'll talk you through it. So it's no surprise to any familiar OD&D player just how deadly combat can be for low-level characters. Using ranged weapons against the enemy can offer a huge advantage. The obvious choices are short bows, long bows and crossbows, etc. But bows aside, what other weapons can be used in this way? The 3 little brown OD&D books don't tell us anything about how handheld weapons can be used. But with a little digging, we can quite easily figure things out. So the basic equipment listing in Men and Magic doesn't really clarify which weapons can be thrown, but there is some information in Chainmail. The table, which gives missile ranges for the various troop types, gives Heavyfoot a 3-inch missile range followed by an asterisk, and the footnote for the asterisk explains troops armed with throwing axes and spears fall into this category. There is also another footnote that explains javelin armed troops have a 6-inch range. Under the missile fire section of Chainmail, it says throwing axes and spears and javelins. These missile weapons are treated as any other missile weapons, except they can fire only once per turn, they may always fire at enemy troops charging them, and they may not fire indirectly. So we do have some rules regarding throwing weapons, and we can conclude that types suitable for throwing are axes, spears and javelins. Further, the man-to-man section of Chainmail tells us to treat handheld weapons as short bows for purposes of hit probability, not range. So we could quite easily say that axes and spears can be thrown up to 3 inches or 30 feet, javelins up to 6 inches or 60 feet, and all these weapons have the same hit probability as short bows. The man-to-man rules also tell us to divide the range into thirds to calculate short, medium and long range. So axes and spears are at short range from 0 to 10 feet, medium from 10 to 20 feet, and long from 20 to 30 feet. And of course javelins would be 0 to 20 feet short, 20 to 40 feet medium, and 40 to 60 feet long. When we look into the fantasy sections of Chainmail, there is also the following text under the description of the halflings. They can fire a stone as far as an archer shoots. But what are they firing stones with? We can probably discard any type of siege engine, because further text under the Chainmail halfling description says, for every 2 halflings firing, count 3 on the missile fire table. This text makes it clear that these halflings are firing as individuals. Some options then might be slings, sling staffs, handheld catapults, or even possibly bare hands. We do know that the halfling was originally called the Hobbit in early versions of the OD&D books. These were exclusively J.R.R. Tolkien's creation, so the obvious place to look is Tolkien's fiction. And in his fiction, the hobbits do not use slings, they just threw stones. The equipment list in Men and Magic also does not include a sling. However, use of the word fire in Chainmail when it refers to hobbits attacking with stones does imply some kind of a weapon. We can easily figure out how Gary Gygax saw it by having a look at the Monster Manual entry for halflings, which tells us that 20% of them use slings. In the AD&D Player's Handbook, a sling costs 15 silver pieces, or 1.5 gold pieces. In OD&D, all basic equipment is listed with prices in gold only, so we could round the cost to 1 or 2 gold if we wanted to add the sling to the OD&D equipment list. The AD&D sling comes with 12 bullets. A score, 20, costs 10 silver, so some rough maths would mean the half gold is for the bullets. The Tom Moldvay edit of the rules, more popularly known as Basic D&D, has the sling in the equipment list at a cost of 2 gold pieces. This one comes with 30 stones. So I think a reasonable approximation for an OD&D listing is 1 gold piece for a sling and 1 gold piece for 30 stones. Encumbrance should be 50, as is all types of bows for simplicity. Now let's turn our attention to the dagger. In OD&D there is nothing said about the dagger in regards to it being a handheld weapon, and we have to remember that magic users can arm themselves with daggers only, so should they have the extra benefit of having normal missile capabilities? This would make magic users with high dexterity scores better fighters. Well, according to the AD&D Player's Handbook, the way Gary saw it in 1979, at the very least, was that the dagger can be thrown just as the axe and spear, up to 30 feet, and there is nothing to indicate magic users can't hurl them as any other class might. For lack of any other contradiction, I think this is good enough for me to conclude that the dagger can be thrown by any class except clerics in OD&D. Speaking of the clerics, can they make use of the sling? As long as they are not loading it with sharp-edged ammunition, stones should be okay, then I don't see why not. So I'm just over the half-hour mark here before editing. So I think it's a good idea to leave it there for this episode. And I just want to say I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks very, very much for listening. And as always, I will see you next session. Have a great week.